Civic organizations have condemned indiscriminate killing of civilians in Ethiopia as the conflict in Tigray region shows no sign of ending. In recent months, civilians have suffered brutal deaths, including at least one being burnt alive. The organizations within and outside that country say the conflict has resulted in widespread harm and destruction of property from airstrikes in Tigray and Afar regions. They say they have welcomed the Ethiopian government's pledge to take legal action against the perpetrators. They are also demanding speedy actions from authorities given the gravity of the ongoing abuses. They are appealing to all parties to the conflict to break with the cycle of violence, take immediate actions to prevent further civilian casualties, and hold accountable all authors of killings, human rights violations, and abuses. Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an expert on governance, security and peace in and on East Africa. He joins us now from the US. A very good evening to you, Abdullahi. Good to talk to you again. Let's talk about the cessation or the promise of a cessation of hostilities to allow aid to go to the places where it's needed most. Has that taken effect? Both sides, first was the Ethiopian government that made that unilateral commitment, but then the Tigray, the TPLF promised that it would do the same. Are there any signs that they are holding true to this promise?
I think it's quite early to make that call, but I think for me, considering how brutal this war has been over the last few months, I think it is such a useful, turning point in terms of how potentially this could be resolved. The fact that, a few months ago, the government announced, a ceasefire at that time, TPLF regarded was government's attempt to slow down the military, TPLF's military surge. Now that both parties, at least rhetorically, have said that they are going to abide by this, that gives me a bit of, optimism, although a cautious one. But the reality is, like you said at the top of the hour, the situation is desperate, and what these, cessation of hostilities, this announcement will do, at the very minimum, all right, people who will need the aid and they are in desperate need will be able to get that. Just to give you a sense, over the last few rainy seasons, the region that is the Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, has not had adequate rain. Because of the war over the last, 14, 15 months, people have not planted. April is generally the one season of rain. If it doesn't rain and, all the data that we have from meteorological department as of now indicates that the rain might not be adequate. So having this window open where aid will come in is an incredibly desperately needed support. Whether it will hold, I think the proof is in the pudding, and we'll have to wait and see that. But I cannot emphasize how important a step this is.
Abdullahi, just give us a picture of the center of this conflict at the moment. We often speak about the Tigray region, but as I mentioned in the introduction, that some of these brutal killings have taken place in the Afar region. But there's also been Amara, which I think last year already it was said almost 1,000 people had been killed by August last year. Give us a sense of the regions themselves where the fighting, the conflict is located or centered, and why are there such wanton killings of civilians?
Thank you so much, because that's such an important question. Because as it is, there is the general, TPLF and the federal government of Ethiopia fighting, but within that, there are many little moving pieces that are not any less dangerous, any less brutal. For instance, the Amara region largely supports the government, that is the federal government of Ethiopia. And as such, they have been recruited, they have been armed, have been trained by the government to be able to be on their side. Just to step back a little bit, the TPLF government that came into power displaced a government that was predominantly an Amhara government. Amhara language was the language of business. The Amhara language was the language of power, the language of culture, food, and everything. And so that tension between these two communities has always been bubbling under the surface. When this tension broke out between TPLF and Abiy on one side, that is the federal government, this was an opportunity for them. And there is a boundaries dispute, which allegedly, according to the Amhara government, that TPLF, when they were coming to take over the government, they took with them some parts that, the Amhara people regard as part of their land. So there has been that tension. So land, power, this has become an incredibly poisonous brew within which most of this tension is taking place. A far region that is, on the other side, that is closer to Djibouti, they have also been sucked into, and there has been brutal fighting there. But let's not forget also the Oromia region, which is always the bellwether of the Ethiopian government. Before Abiy came into power, Abiy came into power on the crest of young Ethiopian, largely Oromo, initially for years, going on the streets saying that the government should stop killing us. The crux or the trigger for that was the government wanting to expand the Addis metropolitan area into what Oromos considered their land, and therefore they resisted. So these people, not all of them support Abiy, enough number of them support Abiy, and enough number of them, many who actually fought on the streets, many who composed music, many who used to live outside the country, when they go back because they fell off, they had disagreement with Abiy, they are in jail right now. And there is tension within the Oromia region as well. That is a third of the country's population. That also is a center of gravity for a lot of conflict that is going on. So in essence, while the Tigray, which is in the western side, and the tension between them and the federal government is going on, there are all these pockets with historical problems that are popping up. Just to make it a little bit complicated for our viewers to be able to understand, the TPLF had issues with with Asmara as well, that is Eritrea, because they fought, a brutal war, 2-year war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And the current president of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, has always felt that that was a needless war, and he joined hands with Prime Minister Abiy, and they are involved too. So it is such a complex brew that makes it very difficult, and that is why, for me, at the very minimum, having access, humanitarian access, is such an incredible opportunity.
Now, Abdullahi, beyond the ethnic clashes, disagreements, fight for land and power, is it also a class issue? Because there have been some pundits who said the TPLF are fighting Prime Minister Abiy on this because they are coming off privilege, the privilege which they enjoyed, the former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who gave them access to a lot of that power, and it's the elite that are fighting to hold on to that station.
Absolutely, there is no doubt about that. This is a largely an elite power struggle, but it is the cost is borne by an average farmer, whether it be it in the Tigray region or the pastoralists in the Afar region, or people who are fishermen that do not have anything to do with it. But I think for the interest of the viewer, the biggest tension, if you are to dissolve all these other things into one, it is the tension over what form of government Ethiopia can take, right? When TPLF came into power, they introduced an multi-ethnic federalism. Until that point, Ethiopia was ruled centrally. And at the heart of that power during the imperial time and beyond were largely the Amhara people. And so therefore, that breaking of, diffusion of power from the center in Addis to other regions has got serious consequences in many ways. For instance, within the Oromia region, they wouldn't be using their language, the Oromo language. After the new constitution was passed that allowed for multi-ethnic federalism, they could use, and similarly in other places. What that does is, much as it's not a perfect system because a fair amount of the Tigray elite benefited during the 27 years, what it has done also is it has acted as a pressure valve where enough resources are going to the local authorities that can be in charge of many of their affairs, apart from defense, foreign affairs, and all other stuff. Things are moving, right? I mean, like, many Ethiopians are proud about, the economic growth that Ethiopia had over the last few decades. A lot of it is a function of that and a very astute government management of the national economy. That is not to say that TPLF are angels. No, there are tremendous amount of egregious human rights violation that they have committed. But here is why, for me, having a humanitarian access is a good spot. And some of these, because in all the statements, be it from the State Department, African Union, the final line was, this is a first step towards, an opportunity to have a political settlement. And I think having some of these things be dealt by, if you will, a commission of human rights, that would be an incredible opportunity to be able to deal not just contemporary historical injustices and human rights violations, but also historical one. South Africans, they have shown the world that it can be done. It's not a panacea, but it really does solve a problem. But that has to come with elite consensus.
So, Abdullahi, then what should the African Union, the role it should be playing in bringing about an end to the conflict? And a great deal, part of that has to do with accountability. As we mentioned, the government, through the Prime Minister, has said it would prosecute those who are behind the human rights violations. But as you mentioned, the atrocities are on both sides.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, 3 or 4 steps have to happen. Number one is cessation of hostilities of any kind. Like, both parties and also their affiliates need to agree that hostilities has to cease. And that should be coupled with humanitarian access. It doesn't matter. It need not just to be the Tigray region, but it needs to also involve the Afar region, the Amara region, as well as the Oromia region, because we need those humanitarian access now. Enough number of people are in desperate need of that. Cessation of hostilities, humanitarian access, and then political settlement. And finally, there has to be an accountability that is not only just, but seen to be just, that it can prosecute the violations regardless of which side is involved. Failure, what will happen is that we will have a plastic peace process that largely caters to the demands and the needs of the political elite, practically a political elites compact. And some of these things will be thrown under the rug. Few years down the road, we will be having this conversation, trying to relitigate not just the violations that have happened before, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, 90s, and now. So I think the political elite in the country need not to be let go. And that is where African Union comes in, the seat of African Union, and that presents a great deal of challenge, is based in Addis Ababa. But I think this needs to be emphasized. South Africans had truth, justice, and reconciliation. Kenya had theirs, although they didn't go about implementing it. Burundians had theirs. Liberians that had theirs. Without this, we are going to postpone the problem. We are kicking the can down the road. And then when the center cannot hold, we'll have, me and you sitting here in the next few decades having this conversation to peace.
And that would be sad. I want to ask you, we've had this conversation before, but, there's often talk of sanctions against Ethiopia. your views on whether sanctions really help to bring about peace, to end, such deep conflicts like this?
I'm fairly skeptical. I'll give you an example. The Sudanese government was under international sanctions for 20 years. I don't think that changed the behavior of this. What happens is a lot of the time when sanctions are put in place, because largely, United States or even the UN sanctions, it's not so much the sanctions, it is the enforcement of those sanctions. Because in the United States, they have adopted sanctions as tools of war, and it is grown into such a massive industry on its own. And the small office in the United States that deals with that, with the help of the Treasury, has become overwhelmed, and they will not be able to enforce it. What does that do? For instance, in the case of Sudan, this elite knew that state entities are the ones that were targeted, the railway services, Ministry of Health, and that. They went about, set up their own hospitals, and they were getting the services that the common man could not access. They were not targeted. Some of these facilities are owned by people who were sanctioned. All the while, people who needed cancer care inside Khartoum, inside all these places, could not access them because they were subject to sanctions. And even when they were not subject to sanctions, what happens is that the paperwork was so onerous, people just stopped doing it. And it also has a chilling effect to organizations that are outside the country, because they are afraid they might fall afoul of the sanction regime that has negative consequences. So they will say, we'll rather wash our hands of that country, write it off and go elsewhere. So that is my challenge with sanctions. It is a tool, but if we expect that in most cases, it will bring about the change of the behavior of state authorities and people in those state authorities, I think history is littered. The history of sanctions as not doing what it was intended, but in fact having consequences that were not intended are legions. So I think we have to be very careful. And that is why, for me, I've always said whenever I come on your show that there is a window, albeit small, albeit short, that we need to grab. If for now, the only thing that we can get potentially is humanitarian access, let's grab that now. Let's not make perfect enemy of good, because there are no perfect peace. There are no perfect opportunities in this situation. There are no good actors. We're dealing with two bad actors, and it would behoove us to say, we have this, let's run with this. At least maybe we'll save 100 mothers, 5 kids, and then we can have a conversation after that.
Abdullahi, hopefully when we do speak next time, we'll be speaking about cessation of hostilities. Thank you so much. As always, Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who is a governance, security and peace expert, speaking to us about the situation in Ethiopia. Of course, we're speaking about sanctions at that very last point, as the United States has been threatening to impose on Ethiopia if the conflict with the Tigray region does not end.